A to Z Mysteries, Super Edition 2, Mayflower Treasure Hunt by Ron Roy. Chapter 3. Dink examined the drawing. "It doesn't look like a map to me," he said. "There are no directions or measurements, and nothing that says X marks the spot. Plus, it's all smudgy," Ruth Rose said. "This looks like a drawing done by some little kid, not a grown man. Why would Mudgett even keep it?" "He'd keep it if it was a map, telling where he hid the jewelry," Josh said. "Maybe the guy couldn't draw very well. Maybe he made it smudgy on purpose, so if anyone saw it, they wouldn't know what it was supposed to be." Josh walked over and asked the woman at the door if she had a magnifying glass he could borrow. She found one, and Josh brought it back. He held it up to the drawing. Ruth Rose giggled. "Josh is looking for a little sign that says, 'Jewels buried here.'" "Very funny," Josh said. "I just think it's weird that the guy everyone says took the jewelry also had this picture." "But we don't know if he even hid the necklace anywhere," Ruth Rose said. "Maybe he had it with him when he disappeared. Maybe the jewels are inside some shark's belly." "Right," Dink said. "He could have kept the jewelry on him." He looked at Josh. "Okay, I guess it does seem strange that Mudgett had this picture if it wasn't important. But if Clint is right, this drawing shows where the Mayflower first landed, up on Cape Cod. If Mudgett really hid the jewelry there, how would he get back there once the boat reached Plymouth?" The three kids stood there, staring at the childish drawing. "What if Mudgett stole the jewels? Then, when the Mayflower got to land, he went ashore in one of those explorer boats," Josh suggested, thinking out loud. "He hid what he stole. Then, back on the Mayflower that night, he drew this picture to remind himself where he'd hidden it. He planned to go back for the jewels after the boat had been thoroughly searched. But before he had a chance, the Mayflower sailed again and landed here, and then Mudgett drowned during a storm. Or got gobbled up by a shark," Ruth Rose added. "I suppose it could have happened that way," Dink said. "So if you're right, if I'm right, the jewels are still wherever he hid them," Josh finished for him. "He never got back there, and the jewels have been waiting for someone to find them since 1620. "But where?" Ruth Rose asked. "Wherever this piece of shoreline is," Josh said, pointing to the drawing. "Who's got something to write with?" Ruth Rose handed Josh a pencil and a sheet of paper. Josh began making his own sketch of the drawing. "Wait a second," Ruth Rose said, as she watched Josh's sketch take shape. "What's that where the eagle's beak should be?" She pointed to the rock that looked like an eagle. "Doesn't the eagle's mouth look like an X?" Josh moved the magnifying glass back over the drawing hanging on the wall. He focused it on the top part of the pointy rock. Up close, it did resemble an eagle's head, and the eagle's beak did look a bit like an X. "It looks like the eagle is carrying a couple of branches to its nest," Dink said, squinting one eye. Josh put his face practically on the frame drawing. "It does sort of look like an X," Josh said. "I wish this wasn't so smudged." Clint had walked back to them. "If you want to go see the place where the Mayflower first landed, there's a ferry boat called the Sea Witch," he said. "It leaves from the pier next to the Mayflower, too." Josh folded his sketch and slid it into his pocket. "How long does it take to get there?" Ruth Rose asked. "Under an hour," Clint said. He glanced at his watch. "The next one leaves at 1 o'clock. Dink checked his own watch. "My mom expects us to be at the hotel by 5, he told Clint. Could we make it back here by then? Oh, sure, the friendly docent said. Plenty of time. The kids thanked Clint, then hurried back toward the pier. They had no trouble finding the fairy called the Sea Witch. There was a colorful sign on the dock showing a life-size drawing of a Halloween witch riding her broom over the ocean. Beneath the picture were the words, Sea Witch to Provincetown. Dink glanced farther along the dock where the ferry was moored. The Sea Witch was twice as long as the Mayflower, too, and the decks were crowded with people. Suddenly, a loud horn blast came from the ferry. That must be a warning to hurry up, Dink said, looking at his watch. We still have 10 minutes. They bought tickets at a small booth, then walked up a gangway to an outer deck. They stood at the rail, looking down at the Mayflower, too, which was moored on the other side of the pier. Let's go inside, Josh suggested. The kids walked to the seating cabin and sat on a bench. Other passengers sat nearby. There were tall windows on all sides, providing excellent views of the sky and water. Another horn went off. 5 minutes, Dink announced. An old woman entered the cabin and looked around for a seat. She wore sunglasses and a shawl over her thick gray hair. Her long black coat reached to her shoes. The woman shuffled over to a bench in a far corner of the cabin. They all heard a final horn blast. The engine started, and the deck under their feet began to hum and shudder. Soon the Sea Witch was backing away from its mooring. We're leaving, Ruth Rose said. She got up and hurried outside to stand at the railing. Josh went with her. Several of the passengers moved to inside windows. The Sea Witch had left the pier and was cruising past the shoreline. Outside the windows, seagulls shrieked as they soared alongside. Some kids were throwing potato chips into the air, hoping the gulls would grab them. Dink noticed that the old woman was watching him. Or was she? Her eyes were covered by the sunglasses, so maybe he was mistaken. But he had a feeling that she was looking at him. Dink stood up and walked a few yards away. He casually walked back, sneaking a quick look at the woman. Now her head was down, and she seemed to be sleeping. As Dink watched the drowsing woman, he realized that there was something familiar about her. Had he seen that mole on her face before, or those gloves with the fingers cut off? No, he hadn't met her before, but there was still something about her that... Then he laughed at himself. This woman looked like the cartoon witch he'd noticed on the dock sign. The cartoon witch wore a scraggly dress and a long scarf and had a mole on her face, just like the woman sitting opposite Dink. Dink shook his head, feeling foolish. Then he walked outside to find Josh and Ruth Rose. A gust of wind made Dink shiver, and he felt goosebumps march up his arms.